Hey everyone, Richard here with this week's reading of Shard of the Sun. My apologies for missing the last 2 weeks. It's been a little hectic around here with the holidays and some things that I've been working on, and I just completely lost track of time and did not get around to doing the weekly reading. So apologies for that. But here we go. We're jumping back into chapter 7. They rode until the horses tired out. Broderick hadn't slept much before they had been attacked by the goblins and was finding it hard to stay awake. It didn't take much to convince the necromancer that they needed to find somewhere safe with a comfortable bed to rest. They stopped at one of the farms they passed and were able to feed and water their horses for a small price. After seeing to the horses, they slept in one of the barns. When Broderick awoke, the sky had already gone dark. He didn't see the necromancer anywhere. Perhaps she is already awake. He stretched and left the barn to see what food could be found. The necromancer was carrying 2 bowls, and he almost bumped into her. "I'm sorry," he said, putting a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "It's okay," she replied, smiling. He quickly removed his hand. "What's this?" he asked, nodding at the bowls. "Dinner. Our host has heard word of the blond man who performs miracles." Broderick shook his head. He accepted the bowl that she handed him, and then used some logs to create some crude seats. Lanterns hung at spaced intervals in the barn and lit up the area around them. The owner of the farm had treated them to some sort of breaded chicken. They ate in silence for long moments before the necromancer spoke. "You and your cousin must be close." Broderick had to finish chewing before he could answer. "We grew up together. My parents owned land near the mountains, and we all lived there. His family eventually moved to Muirwood. We still saw each other, but not as often. When my parents died, he helped me continue working with lumber." Broderick smiled as the memory flooded him. "That's why I will do whatever I can to help him. That's what family does." The necromancer frowned but didn't say anything. "What about you?" he asked her. She stared out in the distance, seeing something he couldn't imagine. "I don't have family," she said softly. She cleared her throat, finished her food, then rose and walked back into the barn. Broderick finished his meal and stared up at the stars. They were scattered across the sky like tiny lanterns floating on a black sea. He thought about the necromancer. What was her real name? Why did she seem so guarded? He could only guess. He didn't know what to do with his bowl, so he left it on the logs and went inside the barn. He found the necromancer sleeping. They had made their beds out of big piles of straw. Her blanket lay at her feet. Her robes had parted slightly down the middle, and he could see almost a glimpse of her nakedness. He grabbed the blanket and gently pulled it over her, then went back outside. The air was warm, but not uncomfortable. He grabbed one of the lanterns and went for a walk. He walked along the perimeter of the fields. Tall green stalks rose up from the ground, and he could see the corn was almost ready to be harvested. Broderick walked for a long distance around the fields, hoping it would tire him enough to sleep. He was wide awake, and didn't want to mix up his days and nights. He eventually decided it was no use and turned back. The lights of the lanterns shone brightly, and the light moved about wildly and reminded him of a large fire he had once seen. And then he realized he wasn't seeing lanterns. He saw fire. He sprinted toward the barn, his legs pumping furiously. He tossed the lantern aside, realizing it was only hindering him. He arrived back at the barn to find it ablaze. He could hear screaming coming from the main dwelling. He hoped the necromancer had gotten out, but the searing heat had kept him from being able to check. He ran over to the stables and retrieved his sword from the saddle. It was hanging on a hook from the wall. He brandished the weapon and ran toward the house of the farmer. He unexpectedly found a band of goblins pillaging the home. "They must have followed us," he cursed and ran inside the house, cutting down 2 goblins who weren't paying attention. He saw several more tearing things apart. It appeared they were searching for something. He heard screams coming from the upper level of the house and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. He was breathing furiously, almost gasping aloud. He kicked open a door just in time to see a goblin hack off a young girl's arm. Her scream turned into a gurgle of pain. Broderick could tell by the blood flowing that she wouldn't make it, but that didn't stop him from slashing the ugly creature to pieces. He searched the other rooms, but found the rest of the family had a similar fate. Tears stung his eyes, and he fled back down the stairs. "This is our fault," he blamed himself. "If he hadn't wanted to stop, the goblins would never have been here." He got outside and found the fire had spread from the barn to the fields and was quickly racing toward the house. Stables were attached to the home. Once the fires reached the house, it wouldn't be long before they burned the stables as well. Broderick killed another goblin, this one alone, before he ran into the stable to get his horse. He noticed that the other horse, the necromancer's, was nowhere to be found. Where would she have gone, he muttered to himself. His eyes widened when he thought of her warning, that he was a target for anyone who knew he had the shard. He searched the pouches on his belt in a panic. It was gone. He should have known. He didn't have time to dwell on the betrayal. He mounted his horse and rode out of the stable. Flames were licking the sides of the home now, seeking to devour everything in its path. He steered his horse toward the road, determined to rescue Octavia, whether he had the shard or not. Looking over his shoulder, he saw the goblins had taken note of his flight. He urged the horse to speed up. He was far away from the farm before he finally allowed the horse to slow its pace. There was nothing in sight. The stars gave him enough light to see a few feet ahead of him, but nothing more. He shook his head in despair. Those people had died needlessly. "Don't blame yourself," a familiar voice echoed in the night. He snapped his gaze toward the sound. The necromancer, astride her horse, came riding to meet him from behind. "I know that you think it is your fault that the family is dead," she said, slowing her horse to ride beside him. "Where were you?" he asked suspiciously. "And I know you took it." Her face showed no emotion. "I was looking for you. When I heard the goblins attacking, I snuck into the stable and got my horse. I had no idea where you had gone, so I rode around the house and toward the fields. When I didn't find you, I feared they had killed you." She sighed and extended her hand. The starlight glinted off the smooth edges of the shard. "It fell out of your pouch while you slept," she lied. "I didn't want to wake you, so I held on to it and kept it safe. I forgot to give it to you when you woke up." She continued holding it out to him until he took it. "You forgot?" he said, the sarcasm in his tone obvious. She nodded her head. "If I wanted the shard, I could easily have had it when you and your cousin came to me with it," she said. "Why didn't you?" he asked. "I have no need of it," she answered. The sun came up a few hours later, painting the sky with bright colors. They hadn't talked much. Broderick was still grieving over the dead family. The necromancer was thinking about her deal with Skiram. Her anger and hatred were strong. She weighed the effects of what her actions would cause. Was it worth the cost? She used to think so. Now she wasn't so sure. She wanted the justice that no one gave her, but she wasn't sure she could go through with it. She sighed and looked over her shoulder at Broderick. He was handsome, with his blonde hair and green eyes. She could almost lose herself in his gaze. She'd begun to imagine what his muscular body would feel like pressed against hers. She never really wanted a relationship, choosing instead to study her craft and gain power, but she found herself immediately attracted to Broderick when he first brought the shard to her. She had dismissed it, seeing her attraction as a weakness. When her plan began to formulate, however, she knew she would have to travel with him. She wanted to hate him. It would make her task so much easier to hate him, but she couldn't. Broderick was so charming, and he had saved her life. Inadvertently, true, but he had stepped into the blow that would have killed her. She owed him. "Kira," she said. Broderick looked up, startled at the unexpected sound of her voice. "What?" "My name. It's Kira." Broderick stared at her for a moment and then smiled. "What made you tell me?" he asked. She looked away to hide her embarrassment. "You saved my life," she answered. "I owe you that much at least." "It is a pretty name. Why don't you use it more?" Broderick flashed a smile at her, the first she had seen since the goblin attack at the farm. She turned her eyes forward before she answered him. "I find my identity in my title. The necromancer is not just something that describes what I do. It is who I am. I crave power. The magic is a means to an end for me." "What end is that?" he asked curiously. She glowered. Gods, how she wanted to hate him. "Never mind," she said harshly. Broderick didn't press her further, for which she was thankful. "Why did you come with me?" he questioned. "I told you at your cousin's estate why I was coming. You can't expect to just walk into Ravendale." "I know that. But what did you feel you owed me to come along?" She sighed with impatience. "I have something I've been meaning to do there, and this just seemed like the perfect time to do it. I don't feel like I owe you anything. In fact, it will be you who owes me after all of this." Broderick laughed, but he didn't think she was kidding. She would require something from him. "We'll cross that bridge when we get to it." The goblins managed to find them each night, and each night Broderick and Kira fled before them. The next 4 days were no different. All right, that's chapter 7. So, no more distractions to keep me from doing the weekly reading. So, They will be up every Friday, as promised. Apologies again for missing the last 2 weeks. Hopefully you're enjoying the story, and see you next week.